I'm Andrew Fry, and I'm joined by my good friend Simon May. And if there's one thing that really excites me about Windows Server 2012, it's multi-server management. Typically, Microsoft innovates a lot of technology, but a lot of what it does is about bringing high technology down and making it available to everybody. So if we can get a bunch of servers to look like one server, that's a really good story for smaller businesses. And I typically think that cut-off point is about 100 servers. So if you've got less than 100 servers, a combination of physical and virtual servers, then multi-server management is really good. And it should be able to manage all of your servers just from the stuff we're about to show you.
Absolutely, and that's one of the main premises of being a cloud OS. The ability to manage lots of different servers as if they are the same server.
Indeed.
And that extends out even past the small and medium-sized businesses into those really large enterprises when we start to look at System Center, which we will be taking a look at tomorrow afternoon.
Indeed. Yeah, so we've got the hooks in place. So we've got a standards-based management, which is all about the Windows Management Framework. We can also apply that to earlier operating systems so that you can manage older generations of Windows Server back to 2008.
So if I do want to be able to manage a Windows Server 2008 R2 server, what do I have to do?
Well, there's a KB article you install. That's going to put WMI 3, Windows Management Instrumentation 3, and PowerShell 3, which is also super important, back into those older operating systems so that you can do most of the things you can do on a Server 2012 box. So they look like just one environment to you.
Okay, thanks, Andrew.
Yeah. So when I was talking about that business of 100 virtual machines, what I was really talking about is Server Manager. You can manage around about 100 machines in Server Manager. We've got lots of other hooks for management inside Windows Server for that scale you were talking about. And indeed, where do we get all this from? Well, partly from listening to really large organizations running server at scale, but also because we run massive data centers. And so we're getting that expertise directly back from other parts of the organization. So we've also got a pretty good story around cross-platform management as well. You know, we can do a pretty good job of managing Linux and so on and so forth.
When you say we can do a pretty good job of managing Linux, that sounds a little bit strange.
Yes.
We can manage Linux devices from within Windows Server 2012?
And the other way round, which is even scarier.
Excellent. Okay, so I can be on a Windows I can be one of those guys that really likes the Linux command line. I can be on there typing some commands that will run on my Windows Server.
Indeedy-doodly.
Ah, excellent. Okay.
Yeah, so it's all very strange because we've actually noticed that not everybody in the world runs Microsoft stuff. And most people are running everybody's stuff.
Absolutely.
So wouldn't it be good if everybody could use our stuff to manage everybody's stuff, and maybe if they're using somebody else's stuff, they could manage our stuff.
Excellent.
It's all about stuff.
It sounds like we have a lot of stuff in order to be able to manage, and that is actually a really important point, isn't it? Because IT pros out there, we all have to manage much more stuff than we ever did before.
Yeah.
So having the ability to automate everything is really important to us, and that's one of the main features of multi-server management inside of Windows Server 2012.
Yeah. So let's dig in and have a little bit more of a look. So where were we? In R2, you could, a lot of the MMC snap-ins, you could dive in and you could say manage more than one Hyper-V host and so on and so forth, but you're using different tools and jumping around all over the place. Now what we've got is a much more sort of consistent approach through Server Manager. We still have those other tools as well if you want to use them. And we're going to see how all that works in a minute.
And I think one of the most important things is that if we think about how we were managing servers with Windows Server 2008 R2, doing things like installing roles and features actually required us to go and remote onto that box, actually be on there with a remote desktop session, and restart that machine from that machine to finish an installation.
Yeah.
Kind of painful.
Yeah, we can add roles and features into machines in all sorts of crazy ways now. We introduced something called Disk Image and Service Management, DISM. It's got loads and loads of really hairy switches on it, but if you just want to bang in a feature into an offline VHD, it's now a simple thing to do inside either the UI or a much more simple PowerShell command, as we'll see shortly. PowerShell 3, I guess the problem with PowerShell 3 is that we called it PowerShell 3. It's almost like PowerShell next generation or something because it's so different from PowerShell 2. What we have now is we have a whole different set of commands. Where before we used to have to get quite clever with WMI to get things done, what we're able to do now is just use this interface, and we're going to have a look at that in a minute as well. And so we've got a much simpler command syntax. We've got more power. We can continue a session after a server's rebooted. We can run things in parallel. We've got all sorts of craziness we do. Plus, we've also got a load of tooling to make it easier to do all of that complicated stuff, which is just as important. It's a bit like having a super complicated video player recorder. If you can't use all the buttons, what's the point in having the buttons? So we've made it easier to use the buttons and give you more buttons.
It's funny, but that's what my wife says about our TV at home.
So more intuitive. I think I said all this already. So we can discover commandlets. You don't have to have them installed already. We've got this amazing ISE, integrated scripting environment.
I have to say, this has been the one thing which, after years of not doing any PowerShell, has got me hooked on, well, basically doing everything in PowerShell now. The ISE makes it so that I can actually just start to code PowerShell live in a really intuitive way. It starts to fill in the blanks for me. So if I don't know something, it tells me what I don't know.
Do you want to have a look at that now, or should we?
Entirely up to you.
I think it might be good to just actually have a quick look at PowerShell, because it's one thing, and we've got these slides for you to share afterwards. I think it's one thing to actually have. It's one thing to actually have PowerShell. By the way, this is the Windows Server 2012. You haven't seen it before. Big squares. Big squares are cool. We've got lots of big squares, and you could put a PowerShell script on a big square and then press one of these big squares with your finger on some device that wasn't a Windows Server 2012 and get stuff done. However, let's have a look at the PowerShell interface, and I think I've got it open already. But I haven't. No, I haven't. So I'm just going to quickly bring it up. PowerShell ISE. That's the ordinary PowerShell command. We can see we're just winging away here. Sorry, I just need to quickly open the PowerShell ISE. Let's get that open. I'm going to actually open one I prepared earlier, just like on Blue Peter. But before I do, if I just go and type in here, you can just get an idea of what's going on here. If I type in get hyphen, you can see IntelliSense working straight away. Get hyphen VM.
It started to look at all of the PowerShell commandlets that we have installed, imported onto this machine. And on this particular machine, we have all of the PowerShell commandlets installed, because I've been away in the background, and actually I've installed all of the RSAT tools, the remote server administration tools, for all of the Windows Server 2012 features.
Thank you for doing that, Simon, because it's going to make my job a lot easier as I show you some stuff. So here we can see a quick list of all the virtual machines running on this particular laptop. Awesome. And then obviously the other great thing I like about PowerShell is the pipe command. So if I pipe something into there, I'm not passing in all that text that you just saw at the top of the screen. What I'm passing in is the class. So everything there is to know about each one of those VMs, what host it's running on, maybe even its IP address, because we can interrogate some of that. We can get properties of it, what level of integration components, what operating system it's running, and so on and so forth. And then we can do stuff to it. For example, I could shut this lot down. I think is it shut down, or is it, I can't remember what it is. Is it stop?
Stop is the right
hyphen
command.
VM, yes, that's the one.
And
yes.
you can find that out because you started to type in shutdown, and it didn't provide you with any options.
Now, I'm always a bit nervous about typing PowerShell, because you've probably seen my typing, haven't you, Simon? So,
yeah, because you've...
as I keep typing in all sorts of rubbish in here, but if I type in what if, for example, then it's going to tell me what it's going to do. And notice it's enumerating that list for me, and so I probably actually don't want to do that, as we'd like to use these VMs later on today.
Absolutely, that would be quite useful. So it just took everything inside of GetVM and decided we could turn them off if we wanted to, and this would be the effect.
And so what I've also got over on the right-hand side here is all of my classes. So if I want to find out about Hyper-V in a little more detail, I'll just go down to Hyper-V down here. And then if we just probably zoom in a bit, we can see we've got all these commands here about that we can do with Hyper-V, which is awesome. So we don't need any third-party kind of mucking about Coplex configuration tools or what have you. We've got all these really good first-class commands on here now. And if I don't know how to do an add VM migration network, then I can just hit show details, and it shows me what subnet, for example, it's asking for a subnet, so I need to think about what that is. So I've got some basic research on what a PowerShell command needs to get it to run, and we can paste the stuff in there. And obviously I could go and write a script, and I'm just going to quickly go and open one I prepared earlier, because I'm much better when I'm rehearsed. So Simon earlier was using file server 1 to show deduplication of some of the new file server stuff, if you caught that session. And if you didn't, this is how you create a file server.
So Andrew's just going to open up this little tiny PowerShell script, which is a little bit more complicated than the one single command lines that we were typing in a second ago. The first thing it looks like it's doing here is you're getting a whole load of parameters from me in order to be able to create the right type of virtual machine.
That's right. But essentially, if we actually look at the guts of the thing, here's a line, new VM, with a name. I don't want a virtual hard disk, 1 GB startup memory, boot device is IDE, and I'm going to connect it to a switch. Then I'm, sorry.
And the thing that this looks, to me, I'm just reading this very quickly off the top of my head, and it just looks very English readable. It looks very, very obvious what everything is doing inside of that syntax.
I think so. I think it's much easier to read. It may be a little harder to write, but we've got those snippets to add in. And obviously, when we start getting into flow control, that looks a bit like, I don't know, C# or something. I'm not quite sure where we got that from. But here's a trick. If I start snippets here, then I can see my I can see my for loop, for example, here. And you can see that all I've basically done is nick that from the snippets. So I didn't even have to know how to do that.
So common programming syntax isn't something you need to have learnt in advance. This can actually start to teach you that common programming syntax.
And obviously, yeah, we as admins should be writing some sort of scripts. I used to write them in Unix when you used to have to pay for the thing.
I used to do everything in VB script.
Yeah, and we were actually chatting the other week to a VB scripting guy.
Absolutely,
and
yeah.
saying, see the light side.
Yeah, why would you move from VB script over to doing everything in PowerShell? Well, it's a lot easier for a start. And one of the cool things that we can do is run things in parallel. So we can run workflows which execute in parallel on multiple threads. If you're going to do that inside of VB script, for example, you'd have to manually go and set up all of those threads in advance. It's slightly painful, whereas it's literally a line of PowerShell.
Yeah, really good stuff. So I'm just gonna whiz down here a bit more because that's fairly clever. So you've put those 4 SCSI hard disks in that we saw in our earlier session, if you caught that, and then we're adding in some other VHDs in here, and then we're starting the virtual machine, and this is really clever. We dug around a lot to try and find this script, and I think you eventually got it working, Simon. So what's it doing?
So what this is actually going to do, it's going to go and interrogate the virtual switch inside of our Hyper-V environment, and it's going to go and look for a virtual machine that's attached to that virtual switch with this particular virtual machine name. So they're going to get the IP address and pass that back to us. Why is it doing that? Well, basically, we've created a virtual machine and we don't know the actual host name for that machine.
No.
So we're going to use that IP address to then initiate a remote command to go and rename the machine, and it's already pre-joined into our domain, so all that stuff's going to work. We're then going to get a machine that has a known name, a known host name, and a known virtual machine name that we can work with in a more integrated kind of fashion later on.
Yeah, so then we just leave it to cook for a while because obviously it's coming out of syspret.
Yep.
So we needed that 150-second wait time in there, which is what the start sleep is, and then we can simply rename that VM. So renaming a VM inside Active Directory, simple as that. And then, we've got a couple of comments at the end. So we've created a virtual machine in a simple line of PowerShell, a very sophisticated virtual machine with lots of hard disks, joined to our name with joined to our domain with a known name. And that's the kind of power of this new world of PowerShell.
Absolutely. And if we were using the GUI to do that, we would have had to have run through not 1, but 5 different wizards, because we've actually created 4 different virtual hard disks and a virtual machine, and a whole load of changed a whole load of settings inside that virtual machine. Probably would have taken us about 10 minutes to do through the UI.
Absolutely. Simon, so that's a quick scan through PowerShell. I think we've probably got a couple more slides on it. Yes, and if I hit the clicker, that would be really good. So, robust sessions, we didn't really cover there, but the idea is there that you would maybe do a whole load of provisioning of a service or what have you. It's going to need a couple of reboots. We could think about domain join, for example,
Absolutely.
and the PowerShell script's going to carry on. Sorry, Simon.
So one of the really obvious ways that you can see robust sessions is if you start a PowerShell connection off to a remote machine, then you lose your wireless access or you lose your VPN connection, that session is going to continue even though you've disconnected, because actually it's all executing on that remote machine. And we can also do workflows which persist between reboots.
And we got some. I think we've also got some parallelism here. Going to come back to this is one of my favourite topics: the world of server core. We get hammered a lot because people don't understand the difference between our hypervisor and the host operating system. We also get occasionally get beaten up about the fact that we've got full-on Windows in there that requires a lot of patching. So in 2008 R2 and 2008, we had the idea of a server core installation. That still exists in Server 2012. But we've got other options, Simon.
Absolutely. So we can do an install of Server Core as part of the options that we choose as part of the installation. That will not place on there the binaries for the GUI. However, if we do a normal install with the GUI, we can later add and remove the GUI at different levels as and when we want to. So we can provision a server, do all the setup on it with all the nice GUI tools on there, then take those tools away, thus reducing the potential attack vectors on that machine, thus reducing the potential patching surface for that machine. And it's a fantastic story now because we have this kind of almost a halfway house with MinShell, this kind of part-way there approach, whereby we have things like Server Manager, but we don't have things like Internet Explorer. We have things like MMC snap-ins, but we don't have a start menu.
Yeah.
It gives us an approach which allows us to administer, but without having all of those potential attack vectors in place.
It can be a really good story in a branch office. I mean, a lot of people, I think, turn off that, enforced safety mode in Internet Explorer, for example.
Absolutely.
Because they just want to get some stuff done, and really shouldn't be doing that. This is actually a better way of doing it.
Much better.
Get rid of IE altogether, and if you don't like our big blue squares, you can get rid of that too.
Absolutely.
So, Min-Shell, easy to turn on, just a feature change and a reboot after that. Before we go for, sorry, just jumping back again, going to have a look at a couple of things. We haven't actually looked at multi-server management, so I thought it might be quite good to look at multi-server management. We're going to go dive down into Server Manager here. If I go onto my local server first of all, we can see pretty well everything we need to about our local server. We can see its IP address is assigned automatically. We can see that Wi-Fi is not connected. We can see that actually remote management is enabled by default now.
Absolutely.
Remote desktop is actually enabled through group policy because we put group policy on here. This is kind of, although it's a demo environment of laptops, we've actually done quite a lot of bits and pieces there. We can see the product ID, we can see events and so on and so forth. Now when we move into the multi-server world, what we can do is we can register servers. So if I could go and add a server in here, and any server that's on my domain I can go and look for and add into here. I've done that already, so I'm not going to do that again. But look at all the servers I can manage down here. I can see their IP addresses. I can see for a particular one, I can see all its events. If I go and have a look at our rather important DC, I might go and do it like that by looking at it for a particular machine. I can see that it's been on. I've got performance counters.
Excellent.
It's all good stuff, Simon. But how did we get all those extra things down the left-hand side? I mean, because I'm not running domain controller services on my local machine.
Absolutely not, because this is your Hyper-V host. You wouldn't want to be running your domain services on there in anything but the simplest of test environments. In fact, we run all of our domain controllers virtually now, don't we?
We do.
But in this case, what we're doing is we're actually going out and interrogating all of the roles and features that are installed on all of the servers that we're managing. So we're going out and asking those machines to provide us with information using Windows Management Framework of what's actually installed on them.
That's right. So if I go down to ADDS, for example, and go and highlight this node here, that is telling me that out there, the servers I'm managing, it's that one that's running domain controller services. It's the same one, but ironically, it's running DNS and so on. But when I hit file server storage, you can see we've got that feature installed on a number of servers here. So we could actually aggregate all of those. Sorry, I'm just trying to hit the control key here. And we can see all the events for a combination of 3 or 4. Now you can add your own groups in here. We can have a look at all the disks, for example, we've got in our storage world here. Scroll down and see all the information about those. Go up to servers at the top here, we should see, we can get a list of disks here, Simon, but I've just suddenly forgotten where I get to it. Thank you, when I hit disks, it should show me all the lists of all the disks being green, red, purple and what have you. And that would be volumes, because I already ought to remember where all this stuff is. That's the view I was looking for, sorry Simon. Just needed to check that. We can see we've got a few yellow warnings appearing here, so we need to think about that.
Yep, got some out of disk space warnings beginning to appear.
So we've got this one cohesive view of everything. But of course, looking is one thing, doing is another.
Absolutely. So we have this machine has the Remote Server Administration Toolkit installed. So if you go and click on the Tools menu, you'll have access to all of those features, all the tools to manage all of the features of Windows Server 2012, whether they're installed on this machine or not.
So I could bring up Failover Cluster Manager, for example, although this machine isn't in a cluster of itself at the moment.
Absolutely, and that's a really good point as well, because this machine we've installed all of the RSAT tools onto. Very, very simple PowerShell command line in order to be able to do that, or you can do it through the GUI. You might be administering your servers in the best practice way, using your Windows 8 machine and having installed the Windows 8 Remote Server Administration Toolkit for Windows Server 2012 onto that target machine. And you would have exactly this. You'd have Server Manager with a completely populated tools menu with all of the tools available to you. If you were to remote into a server, say we remoted into our DC, all we'd have available to us is just this group of Active Directory tools that are listed at the top here.
Yep.
Because they're just the tools that are available for that particular role.
Okay. The other thing we can also do, finally, to wrap up, is I can add roles and features in. We've already talked about doing that remotely.
Absolutely.
I can restart the server.
Well, can we have a quick look at the GUI for doing that? We
can,
probably should do.
as it's used. So I'm going to quickly romp through the wizard screen. We're going to show you remote desktop services tomorrow in our Windows 8 session. So I'm just going to go for a feature. Here I can choose which machine I want to go and apply that to. I can also select a hard disk. Note when I do that, I need to actually mount the virtual hard disk on a host, so I might pick up, I'm just going to pick one here, say London 2, and then I would go and browse to my virtual hard disk down here.
Oh,
okay?
Excellent. So we could take a virtual hard disk that's on any machine that we're managing,
Yep.
and actually manage directly into that virtual hard disk.
Yes, indeed.
Very cool.
The other thing I can also do, bouncing back again, is I can say choose my feature here, so I want a fax server. I guess somebody's still doing that.
Always useful. Somebody out there is probably
Yep.
still sending a fax, particularly if you want to update your expenses details inside of Microsoft.
So I'm just going to keep romping through this until we get right to the end. And here's an important little tip: export configuration settings. All the choices I've just made can be saved out to an XML file, and then I can run a PowerShell feature to pick that XML file up and throw them at a target server. So I can make several.
Excellent.
So it's a way of maybe creating templates off of one sysprepped image rather than having all these different features and having an whole army of them.
So lots of repeatability as part of that robust automation approach.
Yeah, the whole standards kind of based approach. That would be your standard way of configuring a server. You would fill these choices in the UI and then capture those choices. So I'm going to cancel that as I don't actually need a
Absolutely.
server
So
for some bizarre reason.
what about if I wanted to very quickly just go and grab a remote PowerShell session on London DC?
Well, you just
if I
do
go and
that,
hit
yeah.
right click, it gives me this contextual menu of everything that I can do with our server in this case. So obviously I have access to all of the Active Directory Administrative Center and all of the AD tools, but I also have access to configure NIC teaming.
Yes.
If I wanted to. We'll have a talk about NIC teaming a little bit later on today. I also have access to go and start a remote desktop session, or just to go and quickly start a remote PowerShell session and actually execute some PowerShell remotely. So if I just type hostname, that's going to tell me that the hostname is London DC.
And back to the point about heterogeneous management, if I type in ls, I can, actually I probably need to go back up a directory. But if I type in ls on here, I can just see what files I've got on here for those people who like using other ways of crawling directories.
Absolutely.
Simon, that's a lightning run through of all that's good in multi-server management. Obviously, the best way to experience it is to get it yourself.
Absolutely. Go and download the eval. By the way, the links for the eval keep flashing up on the screen behind us. So go and grab the eval while you're on this live stream. Have a look at it. Start to explore some of the features that you want to